Imagine a world where Greenland, a massive Arctic land of ice, fjords, and small indigenous communities, is not just an autonomous territory of Denmark, but the 51st state of the United States. What would that actually look like? How would it reshape geopolitics, economics, the environment, and the lives of people thousands of miles away from Washington, D.C.? This thought experiment may sound like science fiction, but it is rooted in real-world discussions, legislative proposals, and strategic debates. While Denmark and Greenland have repeatedly emphasized that Greenland's future should be determined by its own people, imagining Greenland as a U.S. state allows us to explore the many political, social, and economic consequences that would follow. The idea, where did it come from? The notion of Greenland becoming the 51st state of the U.S. has emerged from a combination of political statements, media speculation, and a series of legislative proposals. At one point, a U.S. congressman introduced a bill that would allow the president to take steps to acquire Greenland and admit it as a state. While these efforts were largely symbolic and sparked international criticism, they brought the idea into public conversation. Political leaders have pointed to Greenland's strategic value, Arctic location, and natural resources as reasons the United States might want to bring Greenland into the Union. Even in casual conversation, some officials have speculated about statehood, highlighting the island's geopolitical importance in the Arctic, particularly as the region becomes increasingly central to global shipping routes, climate research, and military strategy. Despite the speculation, Greenlanders themselves have consistently emphasized autonomy and self-determination. Any potential statehood would require their consent and collaboration with Denmark. Without that, such a move would remain entirely hypothetical. Legal and political realities. Adding a new state to the Union is not impossible, but it is highly complex. Under U.S. law, statehood typically requires 1 point, the people of the territory are voting for statehood through a referendum. 2 point, approval from the current sovereign authority, in this case, Denmark. 3 point, passage of an act of Congress. 4 point, signature by the president. Greenland is unlike any other territory that has joined the United States. Unlike Alaska or Hawaii, which were already under U.S. administration before becoming states, Greenland remains a fully sovereign territory of Denmark. A transition to U.S. statehood would involve not just internal legislative work, but international negotiation, diplomatic consent, and legal guarantees under international law. Any unilateral move by the U.S. would violate both democratic norms and international sovereignty principles. In practice, the only feasible route to Greenland becoming a state would involve the Greenlandic population initiating the process themselves, expressing a clear desire for U.S. citizenship and statehood, and negotiating terms with both Denmark and the U.S. government. Geography, demographics, and culture. Greenland is a land of superlatives. It is enormous, covering over 660,000 square miles, which is roughly 14 times the size of Texas, yet much of its surface is covered by ice. The population is tiny in comparison, with only about 57,000 residents, making it the least densely populated region anywhere near the scale of a U.S. state. Most Greenlanders are of Inuit descent, with a rich culture, language, and traditions that date back thousands of years. They have historically sought autonomy and have cultivated a strong sense of cultural identity distinct from Denmark or any other external power. Any integration into the United States would therefore not just be a political act, but a cultural negotiation. Questions would arise about representation, indigenous rights, citizenship, and the preservation of language and heritage. Statehood could also raise challenges around congressional representation. Would Greenland be entitled to 2 senators like every other state, despite its small population? How would House representation be calculated? Would its people be fully integrated into U.S. legal and educational systems while preserving cultural autonomy? These are complex questions with no easy answers. Economic considerations. Supporters of Greenland statehood often point to its potential economic value. The island sits atop significant natural resources, including oil, natural gas, rare earth minerals, and fresh water locked in its massive ice sheet. Rare earth minerals, in particular, are critical for electronics, renewable energy, and defense industries. Access to these resources could be seen as a strategic advantage for the U.S. However, resource extraction in Greenland is far from simple. Its Arctic environment is remote, harsh, and expensive to develop. Infrastructure is minimal, transportation is difficult, and weather conditions limit the extraction and shipping of resources for much of the year. While statehood might attract federal investment in infrastructure and development, the cost and complexity would remain significant. Any economic plan would need to balance extraction with environmental protection, sustainability, and the rights of local communities. Currently, Greenland's economy relies heavily on fishing, government subsidies from Denmark, and a small but growing mining sector. Transitioning to a U.S. state would likely expand federal funding and economic opportunities, but also introduce new challenges in governance, taxation, and equitable distribution of wealth. Strategic and military importance. Greenland has long been valued for its strategic location in the Arctic. During World War II, the U.S. established military bases in Greenland to monitor the North Atlantic and Arctic routes. Today, its proximity to Russia, its oversight of key sea lanes, and its potential for missile defense and airspace monitoring make it highly relevant for modern geopolitics. As a U.S. state, Greenland could become a central hub for Arctic military operations. This could improve American capabilities for surveillance, early warning systems, and Arctic defense. However, it could also escalate tensions with Russia and China, both of which have growing interests in the region. Expanding the U.S. military presence on Greenlandic soil could have significant implications for NATO alliances and international Arctic governance. Environmental and climate considerations. Greenland's massive ice sheet is a critical component of the global climate system. Incorporating Greenland as a U.S. state would place enormous environmental responsibility on the federal government. The U.S. would have direct influence over climate research, environmental protection, and policies for resource extraction. On one hand, U.S. statehood could enable enhanced environmental protections, scientific research, and climate monitoring programs. On the other hand, economic pressures and political priorities might push for increased resource exploitation, potentially creating conflicts with climate objectives. Balancing these priorities would be one of the most complex challenges of statehood. Social and cultural integration. Adding Greenland as a U.S. state would involve more than legal and economic integration. It would also require cultural and social adaptation. Greenlanders have their own languages, governance structures, and traditions, and they would need protection and recognition within a federal system designed for very different populations. Education, language preservation, and representation would be crucial. Social services would need adaptation to local needs, and federal agencies would have to collaborate closely with local authorities. Mismanagement could result in cultural marginalization or resentment, making social integration just as important as political integration. Criticisms and challenges. Critics of the idea emphasize legal, ethical, and diplomatic hurdles. Any forced acquisition would violate international law and Greenland's sovereignty. Greenlanders have consistently expressed that they do not want to become U.S. citizens. Denmark insists that Greenland's future must be decided internally. Unilateral action could destabilize international alliances and strain U.S.-European relations. Even with goodwill and consent, logistical challenges such as distance, population size, climate, and infrastructure make statehood extremely difficult. Greenland would be the only state so remote from the contiguous U.S., which would complicate federal administration, transportation, and delivery of services. Hypothetical path to statehood. If Greenlanders voted for U.S. statehood and Denmark consented, the process might look like this. 1-point referendum in Greenland. A democratic vote approving statehood. 2 Negotiation with Denmark, agreements on sovereignty transfer, citizenship, and economic terms. 3.U Congressional approval, passage of an admission act and signature by the president. 4-point transition period, establishing representation in Congress, local government integration, and infrastructure planning. 5 Economic, environmental, and social integration, federal investment, cultural preservation, and environmental management. Only with the full consent of all parties could Greenland become a legitimate and sustainable U.S. state. Long-term implications. If Greenland became the 51st state, the long-term consequences would be profound, reshaping politics, culture, economics, and the environment on a global scale. Here's a closer look at what could happen. Expanded Arctic influence. Greenland's strategic position in the Arctic would dramatically increase U.S. influence in the region. The U.S. would gain direct oversight of key sea routes, potential shipping lanes opened by melting ice, and proximity to emerging natural resource frontiers. Military strategy and Arctic defense planning would shift, giving the U.S. a stronger role in monitoring Russian and Chinese activities and asserting influence over international Arctic governance. Environmental leadership or tension. With Greenland's massive ice sheet and fragile ecosystems, U.S. policy decisions would draw global attention. Responsible climate stewardship could establish the U.S. as a leader in Arctic environmental protection and research, contributing to scientific understanding of rising sea levels and climate change. On the other hand, aggressive resource exploitation or poorly managed infrastructure could spark international criticism, conflicts with indigenous communities, and environmental backlash, forcing careful balancing between economic development and sustainability. Access to natural resources. Greenland is rich in minerals, rare earth elements, oil, natural gas, and freshwater. As a U.S. state, the nation would gain legal access to these strategic resources, which could strengthen supply chains for technology, energy, and defense sectors. However, development would require major investment in infrastructure, logistics, and environmental protection. Mismanagement or overexploitation could create long-term economic and ecological costs, so sustainable strategies would be essential. Cultural enrichment and integration. Greenland has a unique indigenous Inuit heritage, language, and cultural traditions. U.S. statehood would introduce a new dimension to America's cultural fabric. Integrating Greenlandic culture could enrich the national identity, foster educational and artistic exchange, and encourage broader recognition of indigenous histories. At the same time, careful policies would be required to protect local languages, traditions, and self-governance, preventing cultural marginalization while celebrating diversity. Geopolitical recalibration. The addition of Greenland would trigger adjustments in global alliances, particularly within NATO, Europe, and the Arctic Council. European nations, including Denmark, would need to rethink their strategic and defense planning, while other Arctic nations would consider U.S. expansion in regional negotiations. Greenland's statehood could become a focal point in global power dynamics, influencing everything from trade routes to military posture as nations recalibrate to the United States' enlarged territorial footprint. Economic and infrastructure challenges beyond resources. Greenland's small population and harsh environment would require significant investment in infrastructure, healthcare, and social services. Federal programs would need to adapt to Arctic conditions, ensuring access to energy, transportation, and communications. While these efforts could create economic opportunities and jobs, they would also require long-term commitment and careful planning to avoid marginalizing local communities. Scientific and research opportunities. Greenland's unique geography and climate make it an invaluable laboratory for scientific research. As a U.S. state, federal agencies could expand studies on glaciology, climate change, and Arctic ecosystems. Universities, research centers, and private companies could collaborate with local communities, leading to breakthroughs in environmental science, sustainable technology, and Arctic innovation. Global ripple effects. The addition of Greenland would not just change U.S. policy, it would reshape international relations and perceptions. Countries across Europe, Asia, and the Arctic region would need to adjust to a U.S. presence in what was formerly a Danish territory. Trade patterns, military alliances, and climate agreements could all shift in response, making Greenland's statehood a pivotal moment in 21st century geopolitics. In short, Greenland, as the 51st state, would transform more than just the map. It would influence global strategy, environmental policy, cultural identity, and scientific research. The world would not simply adjust, it would fundamentally reconfigure around this enormous and strategically significant addition, redefining America's role in the Arctic and beyond. Final thoughts. While imagining Greenland as the 51st state is intriguing, reality makes it extremely unlikely. Legal, political, cultural, and logistical barriers make unilateral statehood impossible. The only plausible path would require Greenlanders themselves to vote for it and negotiate terms with Denmark and the U.S. government. Whether it's about global politics, climate leadership, or cultural preservation, the Greenland hypothetical teaches us that every decision about territory carries deep consequences far beyond borders. If you enjoyed this exploration, like, subscribe, and comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. Would Greenland thrive as the 51st state, or should it remain independent? What would you name Greenland if it became part of the United States? Let's discuss.